This video is sponsored by World Anvil. Why did D&D 5th edition get so popular? Dungeons & Dragons has gone through a lot of different rule variations over the past 5 decades, but the version of the game that we've been playing for the past 10 years has sold better than any other version of the game. But how exactly did that happen? What led to D&D 5e becoming a runaway success? If you ask a lot of people in this hobby, including a lot of my fellow dungeon tubers, they'll say the answer is obvious. Critical Role and Stranger Things. The success of both those shows boosted D&D, and so the game was able to ride that wave to massive profits. And those were absolutely huge factors in D&D 5e's success, no doubt about it. But I also think when we simplify the conversation to just those two shows, we forget about a lot of other factors that led to 5e becoming such a huge deal. Because I believe D&D 5th edition truly benefited from a perfect storm of circumstances that all worked together to make 5e the ultimate TTRPG success story. And so today, I want to identify all of the ways Wizards of the Coast got extremely lucky with timing and were able to ride the wave of that perfect storm. And we'll also talk about what this means for the new edition of the game. Because at the risk of mixing my metaphors, I'm pretty doubtful lightning is going to strike twice. Before we continue, just a reminder to subscribe to the channel. Only 41% of my viewers are subscribed, and so that means 59% of you probably aren't subscribed. So if you haven't hit the button yet, make sure to subscribe. Thank you so much. 5th edition D&D came out in 2014, and for most of this video, we're going to talk about the ways D&D benefited from circumstances that came about throughout the publication history of 5th edition. However, the road to 5th edition was paved with factors that led to its eventual success. First of all, pop culture as a whole changed over the course of the 15 years leading up to 5th edition's release. In the early 2000s, there was a seismic shift in nerd culture becoming mainstream. The Lord of the Rings trilogy, a wave of groundbreaking superhero movies like the X-Men, Spider-Man, and Dark Knight films, and of course the early days of the MCU, these were all huge, industry-shaking examples of nerdy properties being exposed to a wider audience, and that audience saying, hey, yeah, actually this rules. And then of course we had Game of Thrones in 2011, and that turned the fantasy genre into prestige TV. Game of Thrones blew the doors off pop culture, paving the way for dozens of new fantasy and sci-fi fans to begin taking an interest in the more niche aspects of the hobby. When D&D 5e came out in 2014, Game of Thrones had aired 4 seasons, and had become the most talked about and arguably beloved show of its time, a monumental accomplishment for a fantasy series. Of course, we didn't realize yet that seasons 5 through 8 were going to be radically worse than the first 4, with each new season getting exponentially dumber, but that's neither here nor there. You also had the rise of geek chic, where nerds were no longer considered grubby little losers, now they were trendsetters. I specifically remember the 10th Doctor's wardrobe was always praised for being exactly that, a representation of geek chic and a sign that nerds were becoming cool. Then you have the nostalgia of this era. This is more true of the 2010s than it is of the 2000s, but even still, between adaptations of classic 80s properties like G.I. Joe and Transformers, and nostalgia-inspired original stories like Super 8 and another big example we'll get to later, these 2 decades marked a big push for 80s nostalgia. And then the 80s nostalgia combined with the rise of nerd culture and geek chic, and suddenly we had a bunch of TV shows doing episodes focused on D&D. The Big Bang Theory had the characters talk about and play D&D a few times during this period, but the 2 big examples of excellent D&D themed TV episodes from this era were from the IT Crowd and Community. And I think the reason these episodes succeeded is because they essentially followed the same formula as the Freaks and Geeks finale way back in the year 2000. You start by acknowledging the stereotype that D&D is a game that nerdy men play, and then you demonstrate that, actually, anyone can have a great time playing this. And maybe that Freaks and Geeks episode was just a bit before its time, but the IT Crowd and Community episodes hit the zeitgeist at exactly the right point for an audience to see a diverse group of people playing D&D and think to themselves, huh, you know, that does sound fun. It wasn't enough to get a lot of people into game stores just yet, but it was enough to start working in the background of people's minds, so some major pop culture shifts could go on to ignite that interest at a later date. While we're talking about shifts in pop culture, do you remember the rise of board game culture in this era? Because that was a pretty big deal. Over just a few years, people started more openly playing games like Settlers of Catan and Bang. People would gather for board game nights. Board game cafes became a thing. By the time Geek and Sundry launched the Will Wheaton Show Tabletop in the year 2012, it didn't feel like Will was trying to get you interested in board games as a concept or a hobby. He was just showing off some specific games you might not have heard about. But I feel like the show itself was a reaction to this boom in tabletop gaming. Oh, and in 2004, YouTube was created, and in 2006, Twitter was created. That's going to be important later on. But of course, during this era, D&D was still being published. 3rd edition and 3.5 were wildly popular, and they dominated gaming in the early 2000s. And then 4th edition came along in 2008, and while the game itself earned a pretty negative reputation, people started playing Pathfinder in droves. And during this time, we also get the birth of virtual tabletops, Fantasy Grounds in 2004 and Roll20 in 2012. Wizards of the Coast was also developing their own virtual tabletop, which never got off the ground, but they did have some really fantastic digital tools for 4th edition, which are unfortunately no longer supported today. But this VTT infrastructure was able to develop during the run of 4th edition, which meant that by the time 5th edition came along, there were already ways to play the game online, so people could just jump right in. And the last major step on the road to 5th edition came in the form of actual play podcasts. There were a few in the mid-2000s, like RPG MP3, All Games Considered, Dragons Landing In, Have Games Will Travel, and Sons of Kairos. I'll confess I haven't listened to those shows that predate 4th edition because I just wasn't in that corner of the hobby yet. But then in 2008, Wizards of the Coast produced the first series of the Acquisitions Incorporated actual play, where the creators of PvP and Penny Arcade played D&D either for the first time in years or for the first time ever, and all of them playing their first 4th edition game and having a great time. Will Wheaton joined that cast from 2009 to 2012, and then he stepped down, and Patrick Rothfuss joined from 2013 on, and we had more rotating cast members from there. They even hosted on-camera live shows at conventions, drawing huge crowds. And during 4th edition, we got a wave of actual play shows. I used to listen to dozens of these shows, some of which were 4th edition podcasts, like Acquisitions Incorporated, and others covered other shows, or even cycled through multiple shows, like the terrific One Shot podcast. Even Dan Harmon, the creator of Community, started playing D&D in bite-sized segments on his Harmontown podcast. And while some of those shows, like One Shot, were designed to fit the medium of podcasts by keeping things in the theater of the mind, not all shows and not all systems worked that well for that format. Even in some of the official Acquisitions Incorporated episodes that were produced by the people who made D&D, there were combats that involved tactical movement of pieces on a battle map, and those fights just didn't translate well to an audio medium. But honestly, stuff like that is bound to happen in the early days of any new medium. And of course, some of those issues would be later resolved by another actual play format, but we'll get there soon. But the rise of actual play podcasts during this period of time meant that there was a medium and a format ready for more shows when a new edition came out. And I would even argue that among tabletop gaming fans, the audience was hungry for a version of D&D that they felt like they could just enjoy. I've said before that I enjoyed 4th edition, but I never played past level 11 or 12, and I heard people who did would really start to feel the game fall apart at higher levels. And of course, a colossal portion of the fanbase was just fully turned off to the game because of some design choices that they just didn't like. Sometimes the hate came sight unseen. They didn't actually play the game, they just heard things about it that they thought they wouldn't like, so they decided the game was bad, and gosh, I can't imagine what that's like for people to hate something without trying it for themselves. Good thing nobody on the internet does that anymore. But some other people really didn't like the game after playing it. Or, to be more accurate, they didn't like it as a version of D&D. We'll probably talk more about 4th edition some other day, but I've said for years that one of the major reasons a huge chunk of the audience bounced off of 4th edition was that it didn't feel like D&D to them. If it had been called Dungeon Quest or Dragon Slayers, I don't think the reaction would have been anywhere near as extreme. And while 4th edition still had a community of players, it also lost a lot of people to Pathfinder, because Paizo just reprinted their own version of D&D 3.5, and for a lot of players, that was all they wanted. But as a result, these players who were disillusioned with D&D didn't fully leave the hobby. In fact, playing Pathfinder was as close to playing D&D as you could get without actually literally picking up a Wizards of the Coast product. As a matter of fact, a certain group of nerdy-ass voice actors played Pathfinder in their home game, but they talked about how they played D&D, and everyone who knew about the game called it a D&D game. Because people wanted to play D&D, but they just didn't like the version of the game that was being published at the time. The audience was hungry for a version of D&D that they would actually like. And then along came 5th edition D&D, and that's exactly what they got. A pretty good version of the game. Look, I know this game is not without its issues. We've talked about a few of them on my channel. Other people have done deeper dives into some of the classes and subclasses and how they don't measure up to each other. It seems like everyone has at least one rule they can't stand in 5e. And as time goes on and we get more and more familiar with the game and we play it at higher and higher levels, it's just a matter of time before some aspect of the game you never had a problem with start to bother you more and more. However, generally speaking, 5e was a huge success when it launched. I don't think anybody thought it was a perfect system, but the community clearly loved it. It was a huge hit. I don't think I need to sit here and defend D&D 5e, because if you don't like it, I'm not going to convince you that everyone mostly loved it when the game first came out. Either that was your experience, or it wasn't. But it was so much easier to introduce this new version of the game to new people because people really liked playing and running the game. Additionally, if people didn't like something about the game, they could change it without feeling like they were breaking the game. 5e was built as a specifically modular game. You could swap out the rules you didn't like and customize your own experience. And while that was a big selling point that didn't quite manifest in the published game in the same way it could have been, I also chalk some of that up to the way the game was played once it was released, as a specific playstyle evolved, thanks to some influences we'll get to later. Additionally, some of this comes down to presentation. A lot of these optional rules are, shall we say, hidden by the design of the core books, which is always kind of bad. For example, if you want a grittier game, you could combine the gritty realism rules for the Dungeon Master's Guide and omit the feats and multiclassing from the player's handbook, and you'd at least have a solid starting point for a game that feels more like some of the older editions. But of course, the books were not great at letting you know that this option was available to you. They didn't tell you why you might not want to allow feats in your game, just that you could allow them if you wanted to. However, maybe it's because of the game's design, or maybe it's because I just know 5e as a system better than I know most games, but I do personally feel like 5e is a really easy system to homebrew, because so many aspects of the game do stand apart from each other. And so I've always appreciated that it was a bit customizable, because it means everyone can really tailor their D&D experience to be as personal as they want. And speaking of offering a more personal experience, 5th edition also presented a lot more diversity in the text and the art. From the cover featuring a female adventurer who wasn't sexualized, and the first page featuring a dark-skinned man wearing distinctly African-inspired garb, the player's handbook did an especially good job of offering a lot of racial and cultural diversity. The female characters are also presented in a far less sexual manner than they had been in so many editions of the past. This presents a product where the goal is for anyone from any walk of life to be able to flip through the book and see themselves represented. And that is an extraordinarily powerful tool when you want to not just recruit new people into the game, but also specifically break the myth that D&D is only for nerdy white virgins. But also, speaking as someone who was a nerdy white virgin when this book came out, at no point does this diversity exclude anyone like me from the hobby. I'm not a member of any minority group, so if you are, I can't speak to whether you felt sufficiently included by the art in this book. After all, there was text that discussed more gender and sexual diversity, but that wasn't presented in the art in the same way as I believe it was with the 2024 Player's Handbook. And the 2014 book still carried some older, decidedly non-politically correct concepts from earlier versions of the game, like stuff about the drow or the orcs. That stuff didn't really hold up to scrutiny when exposed to a new audience, so it had to be addressed in subsequent books and finally revised or omitted in the 2024 version. And the new Player's Handbook has expanded on the inclusive art, featuring characters with visible disabilities, top surgery scars, and a more varied range of different body types. But generally speaking, it seems like the 2014 book at least took a huge step by presenting a lot more diversity in the artwork. And that book was a huge hit, because you know what they say, go woke, become the best-selling edition of the game in its history. Now, obviously, we can't attribute all that to the Player's Handbook. That's literally the premise of this video. But there are a few other smart decisions Wizards of the Coast made with D&D 5e. And the next one of those was the choice to publish starter sets and put them into wide circulation. Now, this wasn't the first time D&D had made one of these. The first basic set was published in 1977, and there were versions of that same box set published through the 1980s and the 1990s. And one of those was 1983's iconic Red Box, and all those included an adventure. Originally Mike Carr's In Search of the Unknown, but then that was replaced with Keep on the Borderlands, because Gary Gygax decided that he'd rather get the royalties himself. 4th edition also had a red box in 2010, although that had more of a choose-your-own-adventure style campaign or module that helped you learn the rules and create your own character. So it's not like the 2014 starter set was the first of its kind by any means, that is not my point. But this was still a really solid product. It had a rulebook that combined the most important rules to the game and consolidated them into only a 32-page booklet, and that's extremely valuable. Remember, if you're coming into D&D for the first time and you see this fatty rulebook and you're told you need this in order to play the game, that can be extremely daunting. So picking up the Player's Handbook and seeing a rulebook that you can pretty easily flip through and peruse and refer back to throughout the adventure, that's really vital to onboarding new people. It makes the game a lot less daunting, reducing the barrier to entry and making it possible for new players to pick up this box set and just dive into the game, something that is a lot less appealing to people starting up with the Player's Handbook. The starter set also featured the adventure Lost Mine of Phandelver, which is still regarded as one of the best adventures published for 5th edition. And you know, I still haven't gotten a chance to play through it or run it. Hopefully soon. But it absolutely has a reputation at this point of being pretty well loved. They've also put out 2 other starter sets which are both pretty well regarded as well. Not to the same level as Phandelver, but they've definitely got some big fans. So it seems like Wizards of the Coast is doing something right, not just with the existence of starter sets, but in the way they're being executed. But then, if we look at the hardcover adventures WotC has published, we could see another of the designer's priorities: nostalgia. I believe I've touched on this before, and it might wind up being a whole other video at some point, but a lot of the D&D adventures were throwbacks in some way to a lot of classic adventures or lore. Curse of Strahd is Ravenloft reimagined. Prince of the Apocalypse is a spiritual sequel to Temple of Elemental Evil. Tomb of Annihilation is linked to the Tomb of Horrors. Storm King's Thunder has some connections to Against the Giants. That's to say nothing of the books that are literally adapted from older editions of 5th edition, like Tales from the Yawning Portal and Ghosts of Saltmarsh. Volo's Guide to Monsters specifically dove into old school content like Spelljammer and the Fiend Folio. And on the one hand, these were references that the designers were passionate about since so many of them grew up with D&D. But these also help strengthen the brand. I've talked about this before, focusing on your IP allows you to stand apart from your competition because you can put out the products that no other companies can, because nobody else has the rights to use Mind Flayers or a Sararak or whatever. But also, this is a way to bring nostalgia into the equation and try to use it to recruit some of these older D&D players who drifted away during 4th edition. And in some respects, I do think it worked. I can't personally compare Ravenloft to Curse of Strahd because I've only played through or run the more recent version, but I do know that they're both beloved adventures. And so that seems to imply, at least for a lot of people, Curse of Strahd was a worthy successor. I certainly don't think that every old school player came back to 5e, but a bunch of them did, and they were able to enjoy 5e on its own terms. I also once got a comment that basically argued that using the Forgotten Realms as the default campaign setting was part of the reason 5e succeeded. Now obviously, I disagree, I've talked about that before. I think the Forgotten Realms is too dense a setting to be the default setting because it doesn't give new GMs the chance to opt into a world with so much lore. However, I do wonder if maybe using the Forgotten Realms in such a prominent way could have been a selling point for some players. If that happens to be how you felt, I'd love for you to let me know in the comments below because I'd be fascinated if that was the case for you, if nostalgia for the Forgotten Realms helps get you into D&D 5e. Like, obviously I don't happen to agree. I think the complexity of a world like the Forgotten Realms doesn't translate well to the core rulebooks. So the game masters who run their games in the Forgotten Realms but only learned about the world through the current crop of 5th edition products would be woefully unprepared for a player who knows a lot more about the world than they do. And if that's the situation the GMs will find themselves in, then they might as well just create their own world at that point. But fortunately for them, that is easier than ever to do if they've signed up for today's sponsor, World Anvil. World Anvil is a terrific online toolkit that you can use to create articles of the details of your game and its world. You can create articles for NPCs, monsters, magic items, locations, factions, gods, and more. And World Anvil's templates actually give you the tools you need to build your world by offering guidance and prompts. And using these prompts is actually extremely valuable because it helps you come up with details you might not have thought of otherwise. And as someone who's in the early stages of developing his own campaign setting, these prompts are a huge help. Using World Anvil has helped me create a world I'm proud to put in front of my players, and to stay a step ahead of a lot of their questions. And World Anvil is offering a discount to the viewers of this channel. If you visit worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK at checkout, you can save 51% off of any annual membership. That is an incredible discount. Once again, that's worldanvil.com/supergeekmike and use the promo code SUPERGEEK. Thank you so much to World Anvil for sponsoring this video. Outside of the new system, the starter sets, the appeals to nostalgia, the increased diversity in the art, and more inclusive language being used, sometimes, I'm hard-pressed to imagine all that much more that the folks behind D&D actually did that would help explain the meteoric rise of 5th edition. And this is where we expand our scope to the ways Wizards of the Coast got extremely lucky. Because in March of 2015, just a few months after all the core rulebooks had been released, a little show called Critical Role premiered on Geek and Sundry. And this thing was enormous. Because you can absolutely make a compelling argument that Critical Role was the best commercial for D&D until Baldur's Gate 3 came out last year. It had such an enormous impact on the community that there's literally a term called the Matt Mercer effect, and it's all about how people get so focused on wanting the Critical Role experience in their own games that they develop unrealistic expectations for more typical dungeon masters. I think you get a phenomenon like that without Critical Role being a pretty damn big deal. I've even seen billboards for Critical Role out in the world. Granted, I live in LA where the cast of Critical Role also lives, and also these billboards maybe don't actually tell you anything about what Critical Role actually is, so I don't know how effective they are, but you know what? That still feels pretty significant. And talk about how D&D benefited. Critical Role switched from Pathfinder to D&D 5e for the stream, and there were two reasons for that change. One of them was that Pathfinder's floating modifiers were going to slow down combat and, more importantly, make it hard for an audience to follow along. But the other was obviously the brand name, right? It's a lot easier to say, we play Dungeons & Dragons because everyone already kind of knows what that is. It's an easier sell. And Wizards of the Coast reaped the benefit of that association with Critical Role throughout the entirety of Campaign 1 for 2.5 years, and they didn't even have to do anything. It was free advertising. Like, finally with Campaign 2, D&D started to work with Critical Role a little bit more, but for Campaign 1, for that entire time, it was a free commercial. But of course, Critical Role was not the only actual play show to play 5e. As a matter of fact, in just a few years, you couldn't throw a rock at a TTRPG podcast without hitting a 5e actual play. Everybody wanted to share their stories with an audience, and 5th edition was an easy enough system to follow along in theater mind formats, so it translated pretty well to actual play podcasts. The Adventure Zone was a big damn deal, but there were honestly hundreds of shows that never hit that level of success and yet still did very well for themselves, telling their stories and reaching their audience, and of course, sharing the love for how D&D was a cool, fun game that anyone could enjoy. But of course, the podcast format had its limits when it comes to actual play. If you want to run a more tactical combat that requires miniatures and positioning on a map, you can't get that from an audio-only medium. But thankfully for a lot of people, Critical Role had shown that all you needed to do was point some cameras at your players, put your DM in a box in the corner, and point a camera at a map, and bam, you could stream your game on Twitch. And suddenly we had people who were actually able to play their game every week for several hours a night, and run their games with tactical fights using maps and miniatures, maybe even dressing in costumes or throwing some fun set dressing up behind them, and they could live stream the entire experience for an audience. And while I personally feel that Twitch is a really poor format for actual play D&D, just because you can't really interact with the audience in any meaningful way, and new viewers are joining in the middle of an ongoing story, I think podcasts and YouTube are better vehicles to share a complete D&D campaign. But also, I'll acknowledge that Twitch was a great home for a lot of channels that just wanted to document their games and maybe ride the wave of Critical Role a little bit. And And I do not say that to disparage any of these channels. Critical Role was like a bomb that got dropped on the entire hobby, and the way it changed everything cannot be overstated. And one of the most profound effects it had was how many people realized they could stream their games and find an audience. And that made it a lot easier for anybody to watch a game and understand how it's played. And once that happens, it gets even easier to imagine yourself playing the game, and that helps recruit new fans. But if we thought Critical Role would have a huge impact, we were in for a surprise. Because in 2016, the biggest TV show people were talking about was the Netflix original, Stranger Things. Capturing that 80s nostalgia we talked about earlier, it threw in every nerdy reference that the creators could think of to channel those classic supernatural coming-of-age stories like E.T. and Goonies. And so we got a group of kids playing D&D in the first episodes. Cool, what a fun reference, they did that in E.T. Only it wasn't just one reference. Throughout the first season, the characters used terms from D&D to understand the supernatural events going on, even going so far as to use the term of a famous D&D villain as a nickname for the monster. And in fact, they went on to do that in every season, using D&D monster names for the actual monsters they encountered. And once again, this is something Wizards of the Coast didn't have anything to do with, and so they didn't have to do anything to reap the benefits of it. They just own the brand name, so when a show wants to use 80s nostalgia, they're part of that conversation by default. And sure, they eventually put together a Stranger Things D&D box set to try to recruit more D&D players, but honestly, that box set doesn't appear on the show, but their game still gets a ton of airtime. I called Critical Role the best commercial for D&D because I think you can watch people playing the game, you can see the highs and lows of a full session, and you can see how the game can be emotionally investing. However, if Critical Role is the best commercial for D&D, Stranger Things was absolutely the biggest commercial. I would argue that this is the spark that fully ignited that interest in D&D that had been dormant in so many people's minds for so many years. Once I saw the kids playing D&D, this literally changed the definition of the game. It was no longer that nerdy game men play in their mother's basement. Now it was the game they play on Stranger Things. And the kids in Stranger Things do play the game in their mother's basement, but they're also having fun. It's pure, it's joyful, it's not what people might have been picturing for literally decades. Stranger Things kicks open the door, and it's not long before you started hearing people say, you know, I've been really curious about playing. Bob Worldbuilder made a video about how, as of a couple of years ago, Stranger Things was the most significant factor in spikes of Google searches for D&D. Every time a new season comes out, every 4 years or whatever, because Stranger Things is made on a British TV schedule, but whenever we get new episodes, we get scenes of the kids having a grand time playing D&D, and that leads to people looking up D&D and seeing what it's like today, and that leads to more people getting into the hobby. But of course, what happens when they do start searching for D&D? Quite simply, they find other people talking about the game. Now, in the old days, these conversations happened in forums, but remember I mentioned 2 platforms that launched in the mid-2000s, Twitter and YouTube? Well, as it turned out, these would become the most convenient places to talk about your D&D games and your D&D characters in bite-sized segments. Additionally, if you were a blogger or you had a newsletter, Twitter was the place you could share your links with a whole wide audience, and to network with other folks in the industry. And on the YouTube side, well, if you're watching my channel, you probably kind of know what happened already. Matt Colville set the gold standard for talking about D&D on YouTube, and while he certainly was not the first, for a lot of people he was the best at it. He genuinely shaped a lot of what modern DungeonTube looks like. And now we have this whole thriving community of YouTubers who can talk about D&D, and sometimes other games, although whether or not the audience watches those videos is really hit and miss, but that's a topic for another day. But again, the way D&D 5e is the default on YouTube works out great for D&D 5e, and again, they don't have to do anything. And Stranger Things isn't even the only polished production to heavily feature D&D. College Humor launched Dropout, their now beloved streaming service, and one of their flagship shows was Dimension 20, which I believe iterated on the format of something like Critical Role and The Adventure Zone, blending them into something that works a lot better for the visual medium. And it was a runaway hit, and a good deal of their sessions feature the cast of comedians playing D&D. Yet again, that is free advertising. And meanwhile, on CISO, Dan Harmon's D&D podcast got their own adaptation in the form of the show Harmon Quest, where once again a cast of comedians played D&D. Except the show bounced around streaming services. It was on CISO, then it was on VRV, Verve I think it's called, and then it landed on Crunchyroll for its 3rd and final season, so it really couldn't have the same staying power of something like Dimension 20. But also, they didn't play D&D. They played Pathfinder. But if you didn't watch the show, you wouldn't know that, because that's not part of the branding of the show in any way. Hell, even if you did watch the show, if you were only kind of familiar with the concept of tabletop RPGs, you might not even realize that Pathfinder was a separate game, because to my memory, they really didn't talk about that in any meaningful way. I mean, talk about free advertising for Wizards of the Coast. Most of the people who didn't know anything about RPGs probably didn't realize that Harmon Quest was advertising one of D&D's competitors. D&D still gets the credit. Now, it took a long time for Wizards of the Coast to finally really do anything to take advantage of this rise in popularity. D&D 5e comes out in 2014, Critical Role 2015, Stranger Things in 2016, but we didn't get a D&D movie until 2023, the same year we got Baldur's Gate 3. And I do think that both of those did move the needle in flipping people from being interested in D&D to actively seeking out D&D games. And by the way, by no means am I trying to imply that either of those projects should have been rushed. Give artists all the time they need to make the project they want to make. And these were not the only D&D tie-ins we got in those 9 years. There were some comics, and I mentioned the branded box set for Stranger Things. There was also one for Rick and Morty of all things. That was kind of a strange choice. And this year we got that awesome D&D Lego set, which is a bit pricey for most people to actually pick up, but something like that could still act as a commercial for the brand. But once again, that's pretty recent. And so outside of some initial strong choices made when they first launched 5th edition, I don't see a lot of ways that you can credit 5e's rise to WotC. I don't believe it's all Critical Role in Stranger Things. I believe 5th edition was the right product coming out at the right time, and bolstered by a few pop culture juggernauts that nobody could have predicted. But of course, D&D isn't getting those bumps from those juggernauts anymore. We're finally getting the final Stranger Things season pretty soon, and then that's it. The #1 contributor to people Googling D&D is going away. Likewise, Critical Role is almost certainly going to switch to their own game, Daggerheart, for whatever their next campaign winds up being. Like, I highly doubt they'd bother picking up the 2024 rules outside of running a one-shot or a miniseries or something. And even then, why would they even bother when they could just make commercials for their own RPGs, or for other games that could actually use the bump? And while the Legend of Vox Machina cartoon does continue to build interest in D&D, it also draws interest in the Critical Role brand, and pretty soon, that will point people toward their new game. And while Wizards of the Coast has certainly put together some fun actual play streams, usually one-shots played in front of a live audience, they don't have anything on the level of Critical Role that they can actually control. And on YouTube, a bunch of channels are exploring other games, or even making their own games. If you get into D&D and watch a bunch of Matt Colville videos, you'll eventually find out that he and his team made a new game, Draw Steel. If you watch The Dungeon Coach, you'll eventually discover he developed DC-20. Other channels have tried to branch out to discussing other games like Pathfinder and Shadowdark and Dungeon Crawl Classics and other OSR games, and they'll happily make videos about all those games as often as the algorithm allows. So yeah, that perfect storm has faded. Now that does not mean the 2024 rules are doomed to fail. I do believe they're going to find an audience. But that being said, I honestly would not be surprised if the new edition winds up being a financial failure in the eyes of Hasbro's executives. But we'll talk about that in tomorrow's video. Thank you so much for watching. This is a topic that I've wanted to talk about for ages, and with a new edition having just come out, now seemed like the perfect time. And so if you want to make sure to catch the next part of this series when it comes out tomorrow, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you get notified whenever I drop a new video. Leave a comment and let me know, how did you get into D&D? Was it through any of the aspects we talked about today, like the starter sets, Critical Role, Stranger Things, Dimension 20, Adventure Zone, the nostalgia of 5e, or something else entirely? Let me know. If you want to help support the channel, you can sign up for my Patreon or become a YouTube member, or make a one-time donation through Ko-fi. I've got a Discord server full of awesome people sharing their thoughts about these videos, these games, and the hobby overall, so come check that out as well. And I've got a newsletter so you can get all my updates. All those links are in the doobly-doo below, and while you're down there, make sure to register to vote. Every vote matters, especially this year. If you want to talk about other products made to help boost 5e, I talked about a great one recently, a whole book of layers we can put in our games. Watch that video right here. Until next time, play fair, and have fun.